Werewolves, those half-human, half-monster creatures cursed with something deadly, were once so feared that entire communities burned them at the stake. Welcome back to another episode of Secret Archives. Today, we are diving into the myth of werewolves, and it's way darker, bloodier, and more complicated than you think. But where did it all start? And how did this terrifying curse spread across Europe? These beasts transform under the moonlight, tearing through forests with glowing eyes and blood-stained claws, and have sparked some of the most intense witch trials. But they represent something way more than just monsters. The werewolf myth has been around for centuries, with stories of humans cursed or bitten to transform into terrifying wolf-like creatures, usually under the full moon. Different cultures had their own twisted ways of turning someone into a werewolf, like wearing wolf skins or rubbing special salves on their bodies. In some places, these creatures were tied to witchcraft, while others saw them as hounds of God, fighting evil. And if you were unlucky enough to be cursed, there were even bizarre ways to cure it, like extreme exhaustion or using certain herbs. Still, the legend haunts us today, reminding us that the line between man and beast could be thinner than we think. The word werewolf comes from the Old English werewolf, which literally means man-wolf, and sometimes even lycanthrope from the ancient Greek word lycanthropos, aka wolf-human. And in ancient folklore, that's exactly what they were, people who could transform, or were forced to, into wolves or half-human beasts, sometimes by choice, but usually as a curse. It all started deep in Proto-Indo-European mythology. Way before different cultures developed their own takes on the werewolf myth, medieval villagers were already haunted by terrifying visions of lycanthropy, where cursed souls transformed into beasts that hunted their own. It was tied to an ancient warrior society. We're talking about young, unmarried men called the Koryos, who were undergoing initiation rites. And one rite of passage was turning into werewolves. Wolves were seen as symbolic of this stage of life, those untamed, fierce forces, always ready to hunt. In these ancient societies, wolves were worshipped, and warriors would often wear wolf pelts in battle to channel that wild spirit. But these were proto-werewolves, linked to cults where men were transformed through secret rites. These transformations were said to happen during the full moon, usually after a bite or even a scratch from another werewolf. And once it started, there was no going back. The chilling condition was known as lycanthropy, from the same Greek word that echoes its name. The idea of humans becoming wolves goes back centuries, with early references from writers like Petronius in ancient Rome and Gervase of Tilbury in medieval England. The term werewolf also shares roots with many European languages, from German werewolf to Dutch weerwolf and West Frisian werjol. Most of these come from a Proto-Germanic word, werewolfas, again meaning man-wolf. Some also believe the term might have originally meant wolf-clothed, linking it to ancient warriors like the Norse Ulfednar, who wore wolf pelts into battle. The idea was basically that they weren't just dressed like wolves, they pretty much became them, in spirit or in blood. In Slavic languages, there were words like vulukodlak or vukodlak, meaning wolf-haired. Similar words echo across the Balkans, with roots stretching into Greek, Romanian, and even Turkish folklore. And then there's Vurdalak, a ghoulish creature first mentioned by Pushkin in 1835, but whether this was a werewolf or a vampire is still debated. Even Celtic culture joined the myth-making. This hysteria hit a peak in 15th century Switzerland and spread across Europe through the 16th and 17th centuries. People weren't just hiding under their blankets, scared of a wolf in the woods. No. They were taking werewolves to court. One of the most notorious cases was that of Peter Stump, aka the Werewolf of Bedburg, who was accused of being a serial killer who ate people after turning into a wolf. His trial sent shockwaves through German-speaking and French-speaking regions, igniting a wave of fear. He actually confessed and was executed in 1589. In France, there were reports of people being convicted of turning into wolves and attacking villages. These were more than just rabbit wolves. People were straight up accused of murder and cannibalism after allegedly transforming into werewolves. In 1573, Gilles Garnier, over in Dole, was convicted of being a werewolf and attacking kids. Later, in 1580, a man in Geneva was executed after he reportedly killed 16 kids while in wolf form. That's a whole other level of savage. People bought into the werewolf hype so much that a teen was sentenced to life imprisonment in Bordeaux just for claiming he could turn into a wolf. Then, in south-central France, the beast of Gévaudan was terrorizing the area from 1764 to 1767, killing over 80 people. Locals were convinced it was a werewolf, and the whole situation turned into a national crisis. Talk about holding on to that fear of the beast within. In ancient Greece, Herodotus, the father of history himself, wrote about a tribe called the Neuri in Scythia, who, once a year, would turn into wolves. While Herodotus was skeptical of the whole narrative, the locals swore by it. This weird story planted the seed for future werewolf legends. But if they did indulge, they stayed wolves for all eternity. By the time the classical antique period rolled around from 8th century BC to 6th century AD, the myth of werewolves had spread like wildfire. Writers like Virgil and Petronius recorded stories of men turning into wolves. One even tells of a guy who strips, relieves himself in a circle, and then just turns into a wolf. Like it's that easy. And with Christianity's rise, there was a major shift in how werewolves were seen. There were less mythical beasts and more viewed as agents of evil, linked to witches, dark magic, and the devil himself. St. Augustine of Hippo wrote about the transformation into wolves as being the work of witches, people who were believed to have made pacts with the devil. The werewolf now wasn't just a cursed person, but someone tried to demonic forces. Now, even though lycanthropy was a smaller part of the broader witch hunt frenzy, it stuck around, especially in places like Bavaria and Austria. People there were still being accused of wolf charming well into the 18th century. In medieval Europe, people were terrified of wolves, and especially so of werewolves. And when fear and superstition mix, we're left with witch trials. Accusations of being a werewolf were about as common as accusations of witchcraft. King Canute of England, Denmark, and Norway even passed laws to stop the madly audacious werewolf from rampaging through his kingdom. Yeah, werewolves literally became a legal issue. Even kings and nobles were believed to turn into wolves. The famous Prince Vzeslav of Polotsk could shift into a wolf, running fast like it was no big deal. By the time these witch hunts were in full swing, being accused of being a werewolf was a one-way ticket to a grim fate. Some people were even branded with werewolf tats to make their supposed crime, and others faced horrific torture to prove their monstrosity. But not everyone's convinced the werewolf hysteria was just a bunch of scary stories and mass hysteria. Some modern-day experts think diseases like porphyria and rabies could have triggered these crazy reports of lycanthropy, not to mention that people suffering from hypertrichosis, a condition where they grow excessive hair, might have been mistaken for the hairy beasts we know today. Others argued that it was more than just diseases. Some people thought these shape-shifting werewolves were actually serial killers, using the legend to cover their tracks. A pretty good cover-up if the world believes you're a monster, not just someone on a killing spree. And in some cultures, these beasts weren't all that bad. In fact, they were sometimes seen as a sacred transformation. In Asian cultures, shamans would transform into wolfmen with their ancestors' blessing. These weren't terrifying beasts, but respected beings who could connect with the spiritual world. And in Turkish folklore, the kurt adam or wolfman was seen as a healer. However they're perceived, these creatures had people hooked with all these crazy legends. What do you think of this myth?